Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for being with me today. I'm going to run through this very briefly, so I won't take too much of your time, but let me share my screen here. Our focus for today is looking at the ways in which the arts, creative work, and works like poetry, like paintings, anything that's creative, anything that's artistic, sort of impacts and has an impact on the memory that we share of our country. And I want to start out with a poem. This poem was published as part of the 1619 Project, and it's by an American poet named Clint Smith. We'll look at a video of him a little bit later on. But he's a young guy. He's currently working. He just finished a graduate degree at Harvard, and he's one of my favorite working poets. This is all about sort of the history of slavery, like the topics we've been discussing. And as I said, it's featured in and was written in response to a prompt from the 1619 Project. Over the course of 350 years, 36,000 slave ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean. I walk over to the globe and move my finger back and forth between the fragile continents. I try to keep count how many times I drag my hand across the bristled hemispheres, but grow weary of chasing a history that swallowed me. For every 100 people who were captured and enslaved, 40 died before they ever reached the New World. I pull my index finger from Angola to Brazil and feel the bodies jumping from the ship. I drag my thumb from Ghana to Jamaica and feel the weight of dysentery make an anvil of my touch. I slide my ring finger from Senegal to South Carolina and feel the ocean separate a million families. The soft hum of history spins on its tilted axis. A cavalcade of ghost ships wash their hands of all they carried. And so clearly this is a poem that is about history, but it's not teaching you anything new about history. It's merely bringing a different perspective, bringing a different energy to the history that we already know. And that's where I find that the arts can do the most good, by giving us a new angle, a new perspective on history that's already here, right? I'm not asking you to discover anything new, but simply to think about what we're learning about, think about what we're studying, and offer us maybe a new angle or a new perspective. One of the best examples of the assignment that I'll be asking you for is from a woman named Sadia Hartman. She's a professor at Columbia University. And I think she makes clear that history for her, and she does some historical work, some sort of more creative literary work, but for her, it's about making additions to the historical record. And her work she described as tracing the afterlife of slavery in modern American life and rescuing from oblivion stories of sparsely documented lives that have been systematically excluded from historical archives. I think it's important in this class that we talk about the history that you can't read. It's easy to find out what Thomas Jefferson thought about Sally Hemings. It's much more difficult, in fact, impossible to find accurate information about what Sally Hemings felt about Jefferson. And that's not a coincidence. That's not an accident of history. That's not just the way things are. In fact, it is a political project to remove agency, to remove the ability to tell stories from African Americans, from Native Americans, and from women in our country's history. It's a very concerted effort. And it's the work of all of us today, like people like Professor Hartman, to rescue some of these stories, right? One of the most violent aspects of slavery, to me, is the denial of education. The inability of enslaved people, by and large, to read and write meant that their stories are, by and large, erased or unavailable. But that's not a permanent situation, right? I think we all have an opportunity to imagine what those lives were like, to shed some light on what we might be able to gain from looking at them with an historical perspective, and ultimately to add value to sort of improve the historical record through creatively reimagining things that have happened in the past. One more example of some poetry, of some creative work that deals with this issue this is a redacted poem by Reginald Dwayne Betts, another working American poet. And the text he used originally is the Fugitive Slave Act, which in 1793 became law in the United States. And it in fact required Americans in any state, North or South, to return enslaved people who had escaped from wherever they came. And so I won't read this to you, but I think it's really interesting how the visual and sort of the words that are featured within it work together to deliver some important information. Now, I want to do one more example for you. Just give me 1 minute to put the video on screen. And this is from an American poet named Clint Smith. He's the author of the initial poem that we looked at that I read to you. And I want to read this one, hear this one in his own words, called Why We Shouldn't Forget That U.S. Presidents Owned Slaves.
Poet Clint Smith, a doctoral student at Harvard University. He studies racial inequality in the U.S., and his first full-length collection of poems, Counting Dissent, was published in 2016.
Letter to 5 of the presidents who owned slaves while they were in office. George Washington, when you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? How many had to trade in their rifles for plows? Can you blame the slaves who ran away to fight for the British? Because at least the redcoats were honest about their oppression. Thomas Jefferson, when you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children if she remained your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? Did you think we wouldn't be able to recognize the assault in your signature that's raping your slave when you disguise it as bribery, make it less of a crime? When you wrote the Declaration of Independence, did you ever intend for Black people to have freedom over their bodies? James Madison, when you wrote to Congress that Black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? Was it easy to chop them up? Did you think they'd be happy being more than just half human? James Monroe, when you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did Black bodies feel like rented tools?
And so we'll pause there. I think you get the gist of it. It goes on to talk about several other American presidents who owned slaves. So it does two things, right? On the one hand, it offers valuable historical information that the audience may not know, but it does so in a sort of compelling, interesting way that gives you a different way of thinking about the history that we may have covered already in class. So your assignment, just briefly, you may work to create some kind of work of poetry, short fiction, music, something in a video format, visual arts, painting by pencil, whatever format you're comfortable with. I'm totally open-minded about how this is communicated, how this work is sort of completed, but I need some sort of creative work to show that you've learned something in this class so far. It's important that it includes some historical content, but I also want you to be creative to offer sort of a new angle or perspective on the events that we've discussed. The painting on screen is a good example. This was one of the key images from the abolitionist movement that eventually did successfully end the practice of slavery. And the bottom reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" It was reprinted on coins, on flags, all sorts of places for people to look at to sort of advertise their support for abolition. Ultimately, your grade will be based on the historical value. Does it cover some important historical details in a way that is interesting and in a way that's compelling, that adds value? The style, is it sort of clean, professional, well put together? Accuracy. Now, since we're doing creative work, it's okay to make some things up, to invent some things, but please don't contradict history that took place. Don't sort of make it up entirely. You need to have some basis in historical reality. And then finally, creativity. You will not be judged on the sort of talent that you have, if you're great at drawing or not so good at drawing, as long as it's clear to me that you put some effort in, that you worked on it. That's all that I am interested in. I'm going to pause at this time. Are there any questions, comments, anything that I can help you understand before I dismiss today and let you get to work?